All right, we're going to start reading episode 8 now, called The Cattle of the Sun God. Again, we're still seeing Odysseus telling his story to the king's court. And what we've seen previously is some of this information has been foreshadowed in prior episodes of Odysseus' retelling. In particular, we saw this in the Land of the Dead with Tiresias, kind of warning Odysseus not to do something. And so during reading, I want you guys to create a text box at the top of your document. And I'm going to tell you a couple of things that you're going to be doing as you're reading. So the first thing that I want you to do is 1. You guys are going to focus on Odysseus' character. So I want you to mark text for Odysseus' character and the traits like we've been doing. 2, I want you guys to look particularly at an example of foreshadowing. So I want you to mark by highlighting an example of foreshadowing. And again, what is foreshadowing? Good, when the author's giving us little hints about what's to come. And then third and final, I want you guys to, at the end italicized portion that's highlighted in red, I want you to explain and link some of that information to what we know about the hero's journey. So I want you guys to write down at the end of your reading, under the italicized text, I want you to link to hero's journey vocabulary. Similar to what you did for your conclusion of your characterization essay. So those are the 3 things that I really want you guys to be looking for, marking, and focusing on during reading. All right, so now we're going to start like we have in the past with the read this first section. So follow along with me as we go through and analyze the text. Odysseus urges his exhausted crew to bypass Thrinacia, the island of the sun god, Helios. When the men insist on landing, Odysseus makes them swear not to touch the god's cattle. Odysseus is still speaking to Alcinous' court. In the small hours of the 3rd watch, when stars that shone out in the first dusk of evening had gone down to their setting, a giant wind blew from heaven, and clouds driven by Zeus shrouded land and sea in a night of storm. So just as dawn with fingertips of rose touched the windy world, we dragged our ship to cover in a grotto, a sea cave where nymphs had chairs of rock and sanded floors. I mustered all the crew and said, "Old shipmates, our stores are in the ship's hold, food and drink. The cattle here are not for our provision, or we pay dearly for it." So here Odysseus is telling his men, unlike what we saw in the Sirens, he's sharing this prophecy. He's saying, listen, we have food and drink. This provision, right here, this word right here, he's saying don't eat those cattle. If we do eat those cattle, we pay dearly for it. And what do we pay with? Yeah, our life. Death will come to us. So he's warning the men as well. Fierce the god is who cherishes these heifers and these sheep, Helios, and no man avoid his eye. To this my fighters nodded, yes. But now we had a month of onshore gales blowing day in and day out. South winds are south by east. So right here, this section is just talking about how it's extremely windy. They can't go out sailing. They were stuck there for a month. As long as bread and good red wine remained to keep the men up and appease their craving, they would not touch the cattle. But in the end, when all the barley in the ship was gone, hunger drove them to scour the wild shore with angling hooks for fishes and seafowl, whatever fell into their hands, and lean days wore their bellies thin. The storms continued. So one day I withdrew to the interior, she's talking about the inside of the ship, to pray to the gods in solitude for hope that one might show me some way of salvation. Slipping away, I struck across the island to a sheltered spot out of the driving gale. I washed my hands there and made supplication, which just means requests to the gods, so humble requests or prayers, to the gods who own Olympus. All the gods, but they, for answer, only closed my eyes under slow drops of sleep. So at this point, Odysseus falls asleep as he's praying to the gods for help. Now on the shore, Eurycles made his insidious plea. So he's being crafty or sly, similar to what we've seen with Odysseus before, with how we talk about how he's very cunning and tricky. So now on line 879, Eurycles says, "Comrades," he said, "you've gone through everything. Listen to what I say. All deaths are hateful to us, mortal wretches, but famine is the most pitiful, the worst end that a man can come to." So he says, this is the worst day a man can die, to starve to death. Then he goes on to say, "Will you fight it? Come, we'll cut out the noblest of these cattle for sacrifice to the gods who own the sky. And once at home in the old country of Ithaca, if that day comes, we'll build a costly temple and adorn it with every beauty for the Lord of Noon." And the Lord of Noon is just a reference to Helios, god of the sun. "But if he flares up over his lost heifers, so if he gets mad about these cattle, wishing our ship destroyed, and if the gods make cause with him, why then I say, better open your lungs to a big sea once for all than waste to skin and bones on a lonely island." Thus Eurycles and they murmured, "Aye," trooping away at once to round up the heifers. So at that point, all of the men agreed that starving would be much worse, and that they're going to go find these cows to eat. Now at this time, where is Odysseus? Yeah, he's still fallen asleep, so he's away. Now that day tranquil cattle with their broad brows were grazing near, and soon the men drew up around their chosen beasts in ceremony. They plucked the leaves that shone on a tall oak, having no barley meal, to strew the victims. And strew just means to scatter about, so to strew about. Performed the prayers and ritual, knived the kine, and flayed each carcass, cutting thigh bones free to wrap in double folds of fat. These offerings with strips of meat were laid upon the fire. Then, as they had no wine, they made I think it's libatations. Let's hear it. Hold on. Speak. Hold on, let me turn it up. We'll see if it'll talk to us. Maybe it won't. I don't know how to say that word. Let's see here. We're going to define it. A drink poured out as an offering to a deity. It's an offering to a god. With clear spring water, broiling the entrails first, and when the bones were burnt and trips shared, they splitted the carved meat. Just then my slumber left me in a rush. My eyes opened, and I went down the seaward path. No sooner had I caught sight of our black hull than savory odors of burnt fat eddied around me, and grief took hold of me. I cried aloud. So at this point, Odysseus smells that the men had taken the cattle, and he's extremely upset. He says, "Grief took hold of me, and I cried aloud. O Father Zeus and gods in bliss forever, you made me sleep away this day of mischief. O cruel drowsing in the evil hour, here they sat, and a great work they contrived. Lampedia in her long groan meanwhile, so that just means that she's the daughter of Helios. She's the one who was guarding the cattle, had borne swift to the world of the overlord of Noon. They have killed your kine." And the Lord Helios burst into an angry speech amid the immortals. So here I want to take a minute and I want to look back at something I find very telling about Odysseus and his character. So if we scroll back up to line 915, I want you guys to highlight this section of text where he says, "O Father Zeus and gods in bliss forever, you made me sleep away this day of mischief, O cruel drowsing in the evil hour. Here they sat, and a great work they contrived." Now, at this point in the story, is Odysseus taking responsibility for falling asleep, or is he blaming someone else? Yeah, he's blaming the gods. He says, "Oh, Father Zeus and gods, you made me sleep on this day of mischief. You did this to me." So I want to take a second here and label in the margins some interesting elements of Odysseus' character. So at this point in time, is he taking responsibility? Absolutely not. So think about and work with a partner to come up with some sort of a character trait that would work, and explain the fact that he does not take responsibility for falling asleep. And add that trait below, right here. All right, let's continue on. Odysseus goes on to say, "They have killed your kind, and the Lord Helios burst into angry speech amid the immortals. O Father Zeus and gods in bliss forever, punish Odysseus's men. So overweening," which means they're excessively proud, "now they have killed my peaceful kind, my joy at morning, when I climbed the sky of stars in evening, when I bore westward from heaven. Restitution or penalty they shall pay, and pay in full, or I go down forever to light the dead men in the underworld." So at this point, I want you to reread that last section, and I want you to highlight some textual evidence that would be foreshadowing. Yeah, it would be this whole section right here where Helios is talking, and he says, "They killed my cattle. And here's what will happen to them. They have to pay restitution. If they don't make this up to me, penalty they shall pay." And again, that penalty is death. Now, we know from other episodes that we've seen some foreshadowing as far as what will happen to Odysseus on his journey. And we know he returns home alone. He ends up alone, and he has to go through this abyss alone once he gets back home to Ithaca. And so here's an example of foreshadowing about what is to come. Foreshadowing. Little hints about the future of the story. All right, now we're going to read this last section, and this is a section where I want you guys to link some of this to the hero's journey and include that vocabulary. So listen along as I read the italicized portion, and keep in mind, we're looking for any little bits that you could link to examples of the hero's journey stages and steps. So for example, challenges, the abyss, the revelation, transformation, atonement, return, etc. So when Odysseus and his men set sail again, they are punished with death. A thunderbolt from Zeus destroys their boat, and all the men drowned. Only Odysseus survives. Exhausted and nearly drowned, he makes his way to Calypso's island, where we met him originally in Book 5. Odysseus had brought us up to date. He can now rest and enjoy the comforts of Alcinous' court, but not for long. Ahead lies his most difficult take, reclaiming his own kingdom. It's important. At this moment of suspense, Homer might have put aside his harp until the next night. So take a moment, and I want you guys to write over here, either in the side, kind of margin, or underneath. I want you to link this section of italics to the hero's journey vocabulary. So for example, if I were doing this, I would look back and I'd say, okay, they've set sail and they're punished by death. So we knew that would happen. Now, Odysseus is the only one to survive. So this section right here, I would maybe draw an arrow and link that to the fact that he's going to eventually have to do this. He's going to have his greatest challenge that he has to face alone. He's not going to have his shipmates to help him out. There's also some reference to some challenges, the return back home, things like that. So take a moment to mark.